I had the honor of reading Matthias Desmet's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in its English translation, published by Chelsea Green Publishing, and this week, and it's going to be out again, maybe June 1st. I'm not sure. Like the Spanish edition of our book and the English edition of Desmet's book are both out in June.
June comes at you fast.
June probably will be coming at us fast, yes. Excuse me. And in advance of that, you, Brett, are going to do a podcast with him. And I expect that's going to be a terrific conversation. And I got to say, this book is just terrific. And it pushed me. And there's some stuff in here that I don't agree with. But I'm trying to frame it. I think he has a background in psychology, but he does history and history of science, and he just does a lot of really terrific things. So I want to read a few excerpts, but something you just said now, probably 10 minutes ago, prompted me to want to read this excerpt first. This is, I don't remember what chapter it's from. The use of numbers in this crisis. So here he's talking about COVID, okay? Pandemic, the last 2 years. The use of numbers in this crisis makes us barely realize that what we do respond to are not so much the facts, but the stories constructed around facts. Those stories are spun by healthcare workers who genuinely do their best to help, by people who don't want to see their families suffer, by politicians who want to make the right decisions, by academics who want to provide information as objectively as possible. However, they are also constructed by politicians who are under the pressure of public opinion and feel compelled to act decisively, by leaders who have lost control and see their opportunity to take back the reins, by experts who have to hide their ignorance, by academics who see a chance to assert themselves, by man's inherent propensity for hysteria and drama, by pharmaceutical companies that smell dollar bills, by media that thrive on sensational stories, by ideologies that see in a technocratic totalitarian system the only solution to the seemingly insoluble problems of our time. So this is brilliant. And there's so much in his book in which he's basically railing, and that sounds like he's unhinged, but he really, really is not. Again, this is Desmet in his book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is going to be published in English in a couple of months by Chelsea Green, in which he takes on the reductionist, strictly materialist in his framing. And this is where I glitch a little bit. But the very reductionist view of science that then gets handed down to people as if all they have to do is trust the people who say they're doing the science, and then they too are living in a science state of mind, and they too can hope for sort of a utopian infinite life future in which there are no problems, right? And what he reveals here in part is not just are the numbers not our saviors, but we're not even actually responding to the numbers. The numbers on their own don't usually compel people. They compel some of us, right? They numbers and but not manipulatively created graphs and tables will actually compel those of us who are driven to find meaning in numbers. But that's not most people. And even those of us for whom that is true, the vast majority of us still find meaning in story easier. And it's easier to remember at an emotional level, at a visceral level. And so what has happened to us, to all of us, regardless of where we fall in terms of what we believe and what we don't believe and what we think is going on these last 2 years, is we have been handed a series of stories. And very often we don't even know that because we think we're saying, oh, but, newest study says ivermectin doesn't work, so it doesn't work. What are you, a horse?
Yeah, that.
Right.
I wonder sometimes if people don't need to spend a little bit of time you can tell a lot about the story you're being handed by figuring out what the alternatives that could fit in the same moment in history would be, right? Like, what do people think would have happened if pharma had discovered that there was a vast new market for novel, patentable, profitable products, and it was unnecessary because a drug that had gone out of patent was too effective? What do they think pharma would have said and done? Do they think pharma would have said, we are so lucky that one of our past successes that can now be produced by anybody because it's out of patent is capable of controlling this pandemic? And, it would have been nice from our perspective if this had been a business win, but but it turns out that humanity is luckier than that, and we are grateful. Does anybody think anyone in business ever sounds like that? Right?
Right. That said, I think this is a good moment to read another.
Wait, I want to take back one thing I said. I think a few people in business do sound like that, but the idea that an entire industry would have reacted that way, I think, is preposterous. Anyway, go ahead.
So let me actually just kind of introduce the book. So Matthias Desmet, as many people listening will recognize his name, has publicized the idea of mass formation, also known as mass formation psychosis. The English, you can show my screen here, Zach, for a minute. The English version of his book, the English translation of his book, is being published by Chelsea Green, which is just an extraordinary publishing company. It's one that I had already been familiar with, but you go through and you find, books about orchards and farming and COVID-19 and pipelines and, cob houses and, all sorts of things. It's just so lovely. And I'm not going to do that now. Thanks, Chelsea Green. But okay, I can take my screen back here. I actually first came to be, I think, fully aware of Chelsea Green at the point that we were reading Derek Jensen's books back, mid-aughts probably, before we knew him, as we are lucky to know him now. He is a radical environmentalist and an extraordinary educator as well. So this book, in this book, Matthias Desmet lays out just a remarkable history. And I could have written up an entire description of what it is that he's doing here, but I think we'll just do some excerpts here, and then you'll have a conversation with him in several weeks. And then I will encourage everyone to read the book, and I'll put the link to the pre-order in the show notes as well. But he talks about Hannah Arendt in the 40s, I think, I've forgotten now, talking about, of course, the origins of totalitarianism and talking about mass formation, and also a French philosopher named Le Bon in 1895, I believe, talking about this phenomenon. So this is neither new with Desmet nor new right now, nor is Robert Malone, who has helped publicize Desmet's work, responsible for causing a bunch of people to believe in something that he just pulled out of thin air. This not that old ideas are inherently good or new ideas are inherently bad, but this is a concept. This idea of mass formation has been bandied about by very smart people who have seen a lot of truth that other people have not seen for well over 100 years at this point.
Yeah, I would just say people should check out Chris Martinson's chat with him. They have a podcast
with Desmet.
Yes.
Oh, I did not know
Excellent.
that. That's terrific. I'll bet it is. Okay, so chapter 7, the leaders of the masses. This is 2 pages. The chapter's longer than that. The excerpt I'm going to read is the beginning of chapter 7, which is 2 pages. In the previous chapter, I described again, this is from Desmet's The Origins of Totalitarianism. In the previous chapter, I described the phenomenon of mass formation, the psychological basis of totalitarianism, as a form of hypnosis. However, there is an important difference between mass formation and classical hypnosis. In classical hypnosis, only the field of consciousness of the hypnotized person is narrowed. The person who conveys the hypnotizing story, the hypnotist, is awake. In mass formation, to the contrary, the person who conveys the story is usually in the grip of the story as well. In fact, this person's field of attention is usually even more narrow than that of the masses. The reason is clear. The leader usually fanatically believes in the ideological basis of the narrative, not in the narrative itself, that controls the masses. So this is, I'm just stepping aside from the quote for a moment. This is a really critical distinction. He's not saying that the leader who is effectively hypnotizing masses in mass formation believes the narrative, but he believes that the reason he's doing it is so honorable because he believes in an ideology that it's for everyone's good. It's for the best. It's what needs to happen in order to attain the goal that he or she fervently believes.
It's a noble psyop.
It is a noble psyop. Back to Desmet's words. With respect to the leaders, mass formation gives rise to 2 opposing attitudes. Either one trusts the leaders blindly and disappears into the mass, or one completely distrusts them, and sees them as people who knowingly carry out an evil plan, i.e. conspirators. In a certain sense, both extreme perspectives are based on a similar misunderstanding. They fallaciously endow the leaders with a virtually absolute knowledge and power. The first group does so in a positive sense, the second group in a negative sense. Other misconceptions are that the leaders are primarily driven by money, i.e. follow the money and cui bono, or sadistic pleasure, i.e. they have a psychopathic or perverted personality. Such statements are not really confirmed by historical research either. To give one example, the head of the Nazi Party had a reluctant attitude toward illicit profits, and personalities with tendencies towards perversion and psychopathy were systematically excluded from recruitment. As opposed to the classical criminal who finds an intrinsic pleasure in violating social rules, in this case, totalitarian criminality lies more in the uncritical and mindless adherence to a system of totalitarian social rules, even when the system becomes radically inhumane and transcends each and every ethical boundary. Hence Hannah Arendt's famous expression that totalitarianism was a true demonstration of the banality of evil. Totalitarianism is not about monstrous people. It is about normal people who stick to a morbid, dehumanizing way of thinking or logic. In the initial phase of the totalitarianization process, such a logic first takes hold of the population. The masses, or at least a large part of the population, become imbued with certain ideological convictions that to them are no longer distinguishable from reality. The emerging mass movements of pan-Slavism and pan-Germanism in Russia and Germany in the early 20th century are good examples. Germans typically became convinced that as a race they were superior to others, and that stigmatization and oppression of, amongst others, Poles and Jews could be justified by, quote, the facts. We see something similar happening during the coronavirus crisis, where a certain segment of the population is becoming convinced that the facts justify the social discrimination of people who refuse to be vaccinated. The numbers show that they are spreading the virus, don't they? These dynamics slowly give rise to the emergence of totalitarian parties and totalitarian leaders who gradually institutionalize this logic and impose it on society. And this typically happens in a fanatical, blind, and merciless way. Hitler believed that his strength came from his ability for, quote, ice-cold reasoning, and Stalin believed that the secret of his success lay in his, quote, merciless dialectics. Races that were unfit for life and dying classes were, under the justification of this logic, expelled from society with surgical precision. For this reason, what characterizes the leaders of the masses is not greed or sadism, but their morbid ideological drive. Reality must and will be adjusted to the ideological fiction. This is critical, I think, in part because one of the questions we often get asked is, does this require conspiracy? Does what we are seeing around us require conspiracy? And one of the things that we get accused of course, is being conspiracy theorists. And of course, that word is just weaponized, and that phrase is just weaponized and meaningless at this point. And
from its origin.
From what?
From its origin.
What does that mean?
The phrase conspiracy theory emerges, and this is debated by various people, but it emerges in a document in which I believe it is the CIA argues in favor of using this to effectively stigmatize people who were not satisfied with the Warren Commission's explanation of what happened to John F. Kennedy. And so the idea that this was a way to get rid of an entire kind of inquiry is from the outset. Yeah.
But, no one intelligent, and I don't mean educated, I mean intelligent, of which there is some overlap, not total in either direction, should imagine that conspiracies don't exist in the world. They certainly do. If your bias is to see conspiracy everywhere, every time anything happens, you are no doubt seeing it too many places. And if your bias is to say that it never happens anywhere, then your bias is in the opposite direction and is also an error. But what Desmet lays out here, following again from Arendt and this philosopher Le Bon, with whom I was not previously familiar, is that it's in order for the leaders of something that becomes mass formation to take place, what you need is ideological certainty and a belief that they are doing the right thing. They do not need to be greedy. They do not need to be conspirators. They do not need to be sadists. They do not, they actually don't need to be driven by any of the other things, many of which, presumably, many of them are also driven by. But it's not necessary.
So there's obviously a lot that one could extrapolate from here too. And one thing that I think is important is the way in which something that was suffused through all of the functional apparatus of Western civilization, everything from from the Democratic Party to the major newspapers, to the regulatory apparatus, to Twitter, right? Mm-hmm. They are all suffused with something in advance of the totalitarian impulse, right? And so I and others have talked about William Binney describing the turnkey totalitarian state. The idea that totalitarianism is built around you, but it's not turned on at first. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very much more frightening thing because you don't see it. It doesn't look like totalitarianism until somebody flicks the switch on it. But there's a way in which this organically happens too, right? If the idea is that everybody through all of the control architecture of Western civilization went through college somewhere, right? And as they went through college somewhere, they were fed something that was very simple about right and wrong and which side they were on and who the bad people were. Mm-hmm. And at the point it was handed to them, it was just sort of an impassing kind of observation that Western civilization is fundamentally racist, for example, right?
Right.
You can accept that. And if nobody's saying what you're supposed to do about it, then the point is, oh, well, I guess I believe that. And then the point is, at the point they come knocking and they say, well, you remember how you agreed that Western civilization was racist? Here's what that requires you to do, right? Mm-hmm. Your obligation, so as to not be complicit, is now X, Y, and Z. You have to go after all of the people who don't agree, right? For example.
Yeah, it's a version of give them an inch, they take a mile. Once you've agreed to one of the premises that may or may not be true, if you can be held to that by your own moral standards, then you can actually have your morality twisted out from under you.
Right. You have to have some sort of an active process so that, A, you're either the kind of skeptical person who, when they hear Western civilization is racist, their question is, what do you mean by that exactly? Right? Or you've got to be the kind of person who, when they come knocking and they say, remember how you agreed that Western civilization was racist? Well, now here's what you're required to do about it. The answer is, in what way does this follow? And can we go back to your original assertion? Because I was always a bit in doubt about what you meant. Mm-hmm. Do you mean there has been racism throughout, that there have been lots of barriers placed in people's way? I agree. I agree that that's the fundamental nature of what Western civilization is about, that that's its sine qua non? Right. No, I don't agree, right? And, it's very hard to be either one of those, right? It's a lot of energy to be resisting when it seems like nothing's at stake.
Well, so, I could read excerpts all day, and I'll only do a couple of more, but one of the things I'm reminded of from what could have been a 3-page excerpt, but I won't do it, is, he says, Desmet argues, as we have, as many others have, there's basically sort of 3 groups of people, and I remember you describing this before Evergreen blew up. In fact,
as 4 groups.
Okay, go for it. So describe those groups, and then I'll fit that into.
This is what I put on the board 2 days before 50 students I'd never met showed up at my classroom accusing me of racism. So there were 4 groups. There were a small number of people who will instigate a witch hunt. There's a large number of people who will go along with them. There's an even larger group of people who will say nothing. And then there's a tiny group of people who will stand up and say witches don't exist, and those are your witches.
Excellent. So he just hasn't named the leaders as one of the groups here, that's all. We've identified 3 groups that form when a mass arises. The masses themselves, who truly go along with the story and are hypnotized. He estimates about 30%. A group that is not hypnotized but chooses to not go against the grain. Usually about 40 to 60%, he estimates. This again, Desmet. And a group that is not hypnotized and actively resists the masses, ranging from 10 to 30%. Okay, that's us, right? Probably. The people who are listening, hopefully there are some in that middle group. I think there's very few in the first group who are listening here, although I would hope so. He then proceeds, and I won't read the whole thing here, to describe what it is that if you are in that third group, the group that is not hypnotized and is actively resisting the masses, what you should be doing and why, what the value is in it. But the key of it, the central nugget is the first and foremost guideline for members of this third group is that they should let their voices be heard and in as sincere a way as possible, so as not to let the resonance of the dominant hypnotic voice become absolute. Do it whatever way you can. Do it in the grocery store, do it on screens, do it with your family. Just do not simply be quiet and assume that this will pass, because that will be how they win. That will be how the dominant hypnotic mass voice becomes the only voice that anyone can hear. And so then that first group grows in size and it's pulling from the second group, but the second group may be growing in size too, maybe pulling even from those who are currently not hypnotized.
In his book, how extensively does he go into a connection with Rene Girard? Does he?
I don't think at all.
It's not there. Interesting.
It's not, the document I have isn't searchable, so I don't think so.
So it seems to me that there's like a whole little cluster of people who have studied the same.
But apologies, I may be misremembering.
Aspects of the same phenomenon. Yep. Girard, Desmond, Arendt, Stanley Milgram, Solomon Asch, of course.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. No, that's not true. I can search it, and Girard isn't in here.
Not in there.
Asch is.
Interesting. But anyway, it's the number of places where you have some version of, the people are hypnotized by something. What is it? Yeah. Right? Is it the lab coat of the experimenter in Stanley Milgram's case that causes people to reflexively go into a subordinate phase in which they'll shock somebody to death because a scientist told them to? Is it
anonymous peers in the case of Asch?
Right. Is it a need to scapegoat in order to find cohesion in society in Girard's case?
Sorry, not anonymous, stranger peers. Not anonymous, but yeah.
Anyway, all of these things are clearly explorations of a related set of phenomena at the very least.
Absolutely.
And how important is it that we figure this out, because we're just going to keep living it again and again.
It is so critical. So I am going to read one more short excerpt from Desmet and then 2 sentences. But here we go. Again, all I have is the page numbers. I don't remember what chapter this is from. The catalyst for mass formation is a suggestion in the public sphere. If, under the aforementioned circumstances, a suggestive story is spread through the mass media that indicates an object of anxiety, for example, the aristocracy under Stalinism, the Jews under Nazism, the virus, and later the anti-vaxxers during the coronavirus crisis, and at the same time offers a strategy to deal with that object of anxiety, there is a real chance that all the free-flowing anxiety will attach itself to that object, and there will be broad social support for the implementation of the strategy to control that object of anxiety. This process yields a psychological gain. Firstly, the anxiety that previously roamed through society as a tenebrous fog is now linked to a specific cause and can be mentally controlled via the strategy put forward in the story. Secondly, through a common struggle with the enemy, the disintegrating society regains its coherence, energy, and rudimentary meaning. For this reason, the fight against the object of anxiety then becomes a mission laden with pathos and group heroism. For example, the Belgian government's team of 11 million going to war against the coronavirus. Thirdly, in this fight, all latent brewing frustration and aggression is taken out, especially on the group that refuses to go along with the story and the mass formation. This brings on enormous release and satisfaction to the masses, which they will not let go of easily.
Wow. Yeah. So much of that is resonant from now a couple of chapters of our recent life, right? It's unmistakable, right? That the experience is certainly one of facing a hypnotized group. It's like sleepwalkers, and
simultaneously, I'm the enemy.
Right.
What happened?
How
and many in our audience will have experienced this in at least some ways in these last 2 years. At this point, whether or not, wherever they think the virus came from, whatever they think of the vaccines, whatever they think of early treatment, if you're spending any time listening to us, you probably don't simply accept everything that comes out of the CDC's and NIH's mouthpieces' mouths, right? And so you probably occasionally say something that causes people to go, what now? And there's a laser focus on the person who dissents, as a place to focus the anxiety. Like, I now see it. I now see that you're the enemy. And now that I have an enemy, I know what I can do. All I have to do is get rid of the enemy.
Right.
And it's done.
It's amazing how something has caused the paradoxical and ironic idea of scientific consensus, sudden scientific consensus, to be the good.
It's not a thing.
Right? Gravitating to the sudden consensus puts you on the side of good. And who are the enemy? The enemy are people who are resisting sudden scientific consensus. And the answer is, sorry, scientific consensus is either over something trivial that's very easily demonstrated, and therefore it only takes once. If you drop a hammer and a feather on the moon, they fall at the same rate, right?
Or some things over in physics space where it only takes once, like Einstein's observation of the gravitational lensing, or even
that's
not trivial.
Even the multi-slit experiment, you can see it in a single instance. Right. I agree with that. But in terms of complex phenomena, right? The thing is, the farther you get towards complexity, the more you're dealing with multiple inputs, the more you're dealing with noise, the harder it is to even describe the pattern in question, right? So the idea of sudden consensus around something like a new virus and what works to treat it and how it's going to react to the introduction of that treatment and all of that, this is no place it's no place where sudden consensus is even conceivable. So the idea that those who are the enemy are those who are resistant to the sudden consensus is like, well, I think you just, painted a target on every single real scientist.
Right. No, and that's those who are walking around trying to experience having a life are presumably not trying to paint a target on every actual scientist, but that is the effect. And so just at the end of that section that I just read a couple paragraphs from, he writes, "The masses believe in the story, not because it's accurate, but because it creates a new social bond." And I think this is a piece that is often missing from an analysis that relies entirely on, but why do they believe that? It's not true. And especially after 2 years of the kinds of behavioral modifications and experiences that we've all had, or rather failed to have, via lockdowns and remote schooling and Zoom meetings and all of this, the desire for people to have an actual social bond is even stronger than it was before, which is hard to imagine because we are above all social creatures. But the idea that the story, I can offer you a social bond, and it happens to come with a story that just don't pay too much attention to the man behind the curtain. Cool, I'm not going to pay too much attention to the man behind the curtain, because what I really like is now feeling like the in-group and like we're on the right path again, and I'm moving towards the future and towards safety, and hey, look at all my new friends. And that's just, it feels great to people. And that, that's part of why they tune in to, the mainstream media going, rah, rah, look at us. Aren't we all on the right side of history? And that works as a sales pitch, regardless of whether or not you're actually on the right side of history.
Yes, the desire to be in that group is so powerful that what is the group rallying around is secondary. And so lots of people who, feel like, I remember in a prior era, right? The Democrats felt superior for being the Darwinists, right? They were never very good at it,
right?
But they were superior in their own minds for being the ones who had embraced this very important insight. Mm-hmm. And it is, as you and I both know, a vitally important insight. But the point is, most of the people who were feeling great about being on Darwin's team didn't really understand what the insight was or why it was so important. They just kind of had the sense that it was, that the enlightened people were ahead in this regard, that Darwin's a little hard to swallow, but they were there early.
I've actually got, so Zach just put up my screen quickly. I've got a piece in HuffPo this week. No, actually it's from March 15th, but I just saw it this week. Herschel Walker skeptical of evolution. Why are there still apes? Think about it. So, this is a former NFL player who's now running for Senate who doesn't get evolution, and he's a conservative. And so the liberals are really excited to point out that he doesn't understand evolution. But you read this article, and I'm not going to do it, and I'm not going to recommend that you do, but I'll post in the show notes. And you see that the person writing the article doesn't get it either.
Right.
They sort of skirt around it, but it's clear they don't really know why what he said is false. They just have been assured that it's false.
Right.
And so this struck me, I didn't know you were going to say what you just said, but this struck me exactly. It's like, well, sure. Don't we feel virtuous for understanding this thing? Except here too, like I can explain to Herschel Walker or the author of this article why what he said, what his misunderstanding is, and what it actually means that there are both apes and humans still here today. But neither of the people, and most of the people on both sides of this argument, couldn't do it. And so it's back to that Newsweek thing. It's like it's about judgment as opposed to reality and science.
Right, which leads to one of my least favorite moves in analytical space, right? Which is when somebody is caught in that bind, right, where they know Herschel Walker is not onto something by having discovered that apes still exist, right? Mm-hmm. They don't know what's wrong with what he said. And so the point is, the last thing I want to do is say he's wrong and then have somebody say, oh, really, why? Mm-hmm. So what they do is they amplify how obvious it is that he's wrong and how obvious it is why he's wrong, so that they basically bluff and they say, anybody who doesn't know why that's wrong is a fool. Right. And so then the point is, if you ask the question, you're stepping into the role of fool, aren't you? So you wouldn't want to do that. So you're not going to ask me the question, are you?
And it's created in order not to be asked, I mean, just as you said, like, okay, I don't want to have to pronounce anything here because the fact is I don't understand this. So I'm going to be really loud and bombastic about making fun of the people who think the other thing. It's exactly what we're seeing with regard to the Together trial being published. Both individuals and mainstream media pronouncing loudly what a fool Joe Rogan is, and we are, and all of this. Right. Like none of you actually have bothered to try to understand the science.
Right? No, they're revealing how little they know about how the thought process even works. Right. What the underlying philosophy of science that makes the engine function is. Right. Yeah. They don't know, and they're revealing it to us. They're not revealing it to other people who don't know. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, it's maddening, but nonetheless, it is effective.
I just realized that I misspoke several times in the first hour.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I'm not going to tell you how. No, I am.
Do you want to redo?
Yeah, I want to redo. I conflated the title of Hannah Arendt's book, which I knew I was doing. But Desmet's book is The Psychology of Totalitarianism.
Yep.
Not The Origins, which I knew that was Arendt's book. Anyway. Oh, well. It's done.
I almost corrected you.
But then you're like, well, she just read it.
I didn't know what the title was. I thought maybe it was a slight play on Hannah Arendt.
I mean, it is. It's just I got, anyway.